Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me. If you could just bear with me whilst I share my slides. There we go. And I'm sure someone in the backstage room will give me a note to tell me if those are not showing. So welcome to my presentation on delivering the digital dream. The title for this was really inspired by some work that the Centre for Smart Infrastructure and Construction did on a construction site where everyone was trying very hard to curate data and information very well, but perhaps it wasn't delivering to the anticipation of those in perhaps the digital teams of some of the construction site, of the construction companies that are working on the site and so on. So we started to look at how close are we to actually being able to do all the things that are probably possible with all of the wonderful tools that we have around us, but that in fact we're perhaps not always using to the best of our ability. So I found this rather wonderful picture online that I felt was very dreamlike to kick the presentation off. But we certainly have the right kind of intent. So for example, NIMA's front page says that our ultimate vision is a thriving and sustainable built and natural environment transformed by exploiting purpose-driven data, and that with trusted data great things happen. And this is all absolutely true, and NIMA is making huge efforts in this direction. Likewise, my own organisation, the Centre for Smart Infrastructure and Construction, we talk about transforming the future of infrastructure through smarter information. And we think about how we can use and develop data acquisition systems, be they sensors or other kinds of information providing systems, to really inform data-driven decision-making throughout the whole life cycle of our built environment, whether that's designing and delivering assets or managing and operating them throughout their life, or indeed planning for what we need in our cities and communities. However, I've certainly found in my work that it can be a bit of an uphill struggle to deliver on that dream. In the dream, in that perfect future world that we're looking for, we are looking at a world where we have no data loss. And I was listening into the Dame Judith Hackett's presentation and the panel session after that, and very much, this idea of the golden thread being critical, the fact that we keep all of our data and information about the design and delivery phases through the life of the asset. In that ideal future as well, we're able to be on site, whether that's on construction sites or doing facilities management or asset maintenance and management, with our digital tools, and they're telling us what we need to be doing and where we need to be doing it, and possibly even how we need to be doing it. And we have fantastically well-connected digital tools to help us manage our assets across their whole life cycle. This is a wonderful vision, and in some places we are getting close. But I think what we have to recognise is that we're in a challenging environment to do this, because not only are we in an industry that typically involves lots of different organisations at any point in an asset's life cycle, but also we're in an industry where the conditions are not always ideal. So in stark contrast to a large manufacturing facility, we might be doing this in the rain. We might be doing it with lots of loud noise in a very dynamic and changing environment around us. So we have additional challenges to grapple with as we're trying to deliver on this digital dream. However, if we get it right, then there's an awful lot to be gained from it. So just looking at the things that we hope to improve through better data curation and management and use, we want to extend the life cycle of our assets, because we can't afford to replace things repeatedly, both from a financial perspective, but also from a carbon and a resource perspective. Safety is very important to us, and better data and information helps us to improve safety, whether that is for our operatives in and around our sites and our assets, or whether that's for the users of those assets and the occupants of the buildings, the people involved in the delivery, management and use of all of these fantastic things that we're creating. We want to be able to do this more efficiently, both from a financial perspective and from a resource perspective. We want to be more productive, and we want to produce places that are more livable. And we want to increase the capacity that we can get from our existing assets. So, for example, in the world of transport, we want to be able to carry more trains on the same tracks and get more people around on the same infrastructure if we possibly can, before we have to start building new things, because we need to get as much as possible out of all of our existing assets due to the issues around resource constraint and so forth. And as well as improving some things, we want to be driving some things down as well. So we want to reduce waste. We want to reduce risk, both in terms of our projects and programs, but also in terms of the use of our assets. So whether that is, managing safety on a construction site, or whether that is thinking about how at-risk existing bridges are, for example. So, a lot of our actively used bridges are well over 100 to 150 years old. And we need to understand their condition, model their condition, and be able to think about how we best and most productively maintain those so that we can keep delivering the services that they support. We need to be able to do all of this at reduced cost, and as I've mentioned several times already, at substantially reduced carbon. And data can help us do all of these things, and it's really vital in doing that. And it's not just about sort of saving money and improving productivity and all those kinds of things. It's also about helping us to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals, because our built environment is directly responsible for several of those goals and is indirectly responsible for contributing to most of the rest. So there's very few of the Sustainable Development Goals that are not in some way supported through our built environment. So it really is important that we get this right. So that's the dream. We want to be able to do all of this stuff really well and continue to do so in perpetuity. Those of you who were listening to the previous session will have heard people talking about, data lifespans of the order of 50 to 100 years. And the reality is that is what we've got to do. So coming on to that reality, where have we got to? Well, we had the BIM mandate, and I was just sort of looking around the web for some images to illustrate this slide. But, there were queries before the mandate came in 2016 as to whether we would be able to achieve it. I think we made a very good attempt at getting there, and we're still building on that. And there have been various reports since. So there have been things like the National BIM Report, which has changed its name to be the Digital Construction Report, which looks at how well we are digitalising our processes of design and delivery, at least for our assets. The UK BIM framework and the BSEN 19650, ISO 19650 standards have then taken that even further. So that's about not just the design and delivery of our assets, but very importantly, the operational side of our assets. What are the data and information requirements that we need throughout that extremely long life of our infrastructure and built environment assets? And then lastly, there are some other really helpful initiatives around. So the GIG, which is the Government Industry Information Group, I think I've got that acronym right, have done a whole series of documents on interoperability of data and information management. And my own organisation has been looking at line of sight. So how do we link the value of our assets with the organisational objectives that we have, which may be not immediately obvious. So if you're running a hospital, the value of your built asset to your product, to your services is slightly less tangible than it is, for example, if you're running a railway, or indeed if you're running social housing, where the asset itself is very much a key part of the service or the value that you're delivering. So there's an awful lot that we have done in terms of starting to understand, if you like, the rules of engagement, building some really good frameworks for actually managing our data and our information well, sharing that information in a way that's meaningful. But as was certainly being discussed in the last session, and I'm sure was being discussed earlier in the day as well, this is not yet a smooth and friction-free journey. So there is a reality gap involved. And in the work that we've been doing, some of the things that we have come across in this space are things like, for example, data is not always digital first. In fact, it quite frequently isn't digital first. Now, this is a snapshot of an American delivery note for a concrete load, because I couldn't find one online from a UK one. But, this is not untypical of things that still arrive on our construction sites. Much of this data is available digitally, but it either isn't asked for, or there are challenges in actually conveying it to the customers or the clients. So that's certainly an area that we need to improve on, because we've seen a lot of, manual entry time taken. So people who have other things to be doing, but find themselves having to, type numbers into spreadsheets or handwrite them from a piece of paper onto another piece of paper and then go back to the office and fill them in. Even where we have digital first data, it's often held in multiple disconnected systems. So even on a single individual project, what you may find is that you've got some data which is held in SharePoint sites, some data which is held in one database system, some data which is held in another database system. And it's very difficult to connect those systems digitally. What often happens is that somebody has to sit down and work hard to make those links. And related to that is the challenge that data architectures are often sort of retrofitted and evolve during a project rather than being planned up front. So what we found, and this is a clip of a screenshot from a piece of work we did on a big infrastructure construction site, that there are all sorts of pieces of data required for a project. That includes information about what materials have been ordered, what materials are arriving, what materials are needed when and where on the site, but also information about, for example, the quality checks on those materials. And an awful lot of that data is being emailed around in spreadsheets. Some of it is being uploaded automatically to databases. But if you then want to do something like we were trying to do, which was track carbon through the construction process, you've got to spend an awful lot of human hours kind of digging into different elements of the data and trying to pull them together. Because although we can now draw an architecture of how the data moves, this wasn't sufficiently visible or wasn't sufficiently planned for up front. And what this leads to is some very frustrated people. So we're finding that data isn't discoverable, the systems are often not automated, which makes insights really hard to generate. And we've got time and effort being wasted locating and processing data, alongside a lot of kind of disparate digital initiatives arriving that gives people initiative fatigue. So we end up with a number of people looking like this poor woman here, ready to throw their tools out of the window and probably go and have a very stiff drink on a Friday night. So, whilst we have made a big step forward, there's still an awful lot that we need to do. And in my head, what I liken it to is somebody who needs to get fit, going out and buying a whole load of fabulous fitness DVDs, and then sitting on the sofa and watching them with a beer in their hand and hoping that that's going to make them, look like these two beautifully fit people running along the beach on the right-hand side. It's not good enough to have the DVDs. You have to actually follow them. And in the same way, it's not good enough for us just to have all these fantastic frameworks and standards and so on. We actually need to follow them, and we need to do that consistently and look really hard at what we're doing to try and gradually, oil the cogs of data and information management and transfer and use. Because without doing that, then we risk really missing a whole lot of opportunities. There's a huge amount out there, obviously being talked about at the moment, about digital twins, about artificial intelligence and machine learning. Indeed, our government's just held a summit on that. But all of these things depend on good data. And importantly, if we don't have good data, we either can't use them or we can't use them well, and we can't get meaningful outputs from them. So we're missing opportunities to reduce carbon waste and cost. We're missing opportunities to improve our productivity and quality. We're missing opportunities to extend the life of our aging assets. We are frequently demolishing things that potentially could be monitored and modelled and kept in service. And we're therefore missing opportunities to manage our built environment sustainably across the whole of its life cycle. And just as an example, again, this is a piece of work my group did, looking at the volume of carbon that was in the original design of an asset versus the volume of carbon that was actually expended in delivering that asset. Now, unless we can get this kind of data and get it in a very granular way, then we're really going to struggle to reduce carbon emissions across our sector. But if we get this right, then this is we've got a sort of a 35% carbon saving potentially right there that we could be going for today without actually changing very much else in our processes. Now, obviously, we do need to do lots of other things to reduce carbon in our built environment and in our asset delivery, but we need to do immediately the things that is within our capability to do immediately to reduce our carbon emissions. And the same is true across a whole range of other things in terms of our delivery and operation of our built assets. So really what this comes down to is we do know what we need to do, but we need to get on and do it, which sounds terribly easy, but obviously isn't, because if it was, we'd all be doing it already. And many of you will have seen this diagram before. It originally appeared, I think, in the Flourishing Systems paper that we published a little while ago. Really what this is saying is that we need to ask for the right data and information at every point during an asset's life. And if we do that, then there's real potential to use technologies like digital twins, informed by AI and other kinds of modelling, excuse me, to really help us draw insights about our built environment and make appropriate interventions on the actual physical assets in order that we can manage and maintain them better. So what do we need to do? Well, I've alluded to quite a few of these things already, but fundamentally what we need to do is to plan for data use at the outset. Who will need access to what, when, where, and for what? And this where question is quite important because it's very different if you're accessing a system in the office versus if you're accessing a system out, trackside on a railway or on a construction site or what have you. And we need to develop and implement a data strategy that works for those on the front line, whether they're on the front line, as I said, trackside, or whether they're on the front line of trying to manage a complex facility and keep all of the occupants happy at the same time. And as I said, we need to remember that different environments create very different challenges. So the solutions that are appropriate for someone on the construction site at the bottom will probably look rather different to the solutions for someone sort of standing in the command center of a construction program, or indeed of a railway operations unit, even though they might be drawing on similar data sources. Having planned for data use at the outset, we need to make sure that we think whole life and not just first use. So as an industry, we're actually flush with data. We produce a phenomenal amount of data. The challenge is that frequently we only look at it once and then we archive it somewhere we can never retrieve it from, or we throw it away completely. And really what we need to do is get much better value out of our data by collecting it once and looking at it many times rather than repeatedly collecting the same data. And the other thing we need to think about, and this came up in the earlier session as well, is how we use that data going forward. So data has to be available and accessible or discoverable. So we need to have it and we need to know that we've got it. We need to be able to retrieve it and we need to be able to potentially reuse it. So in that context, really understanding what the data is and making sure we've got all the right metadata on those things so that we can use data again for a different purpose. We need to be flexible about how we use that, but also importantly, we need to future-proof our data systems. And this is really about thinking through what happens at the end of a contract, what happens between the end of an asset being built and its handover, what happens at the interface between two facilities management or asset management contracts, what happens if technology changes, what are we doing with our data and what strategies do we have around our data to make sure that it continues to be used and useful over the next 50 to 100 years, because so many of our assets, even the ones we're building today, will be with us in 50 to 100 years' time. But many of the assets that we've had around us for a very long time will still be with us then as well. We need to be digital first as far as we can. So, for example, let's get away from paper delivery notes and move to electronic ones. And we need to be really trying to keep systems as simple as possible for the users. So the background architecture may have a certain amount of complexity in it, but the people who are using it should be able to interface with it relatively easily. So the apps that stand on top of that need to be as simple as they can be for the purpose, but also as similar as they can be to each other. One of the great things about different word processing apps, for example, is that you can now flip from one to another, and broadly speaking, you find the same things on the same menus everywhere. So it doesn't matter which one you're using, you know roughly where you're going to find the information. And we need to make it as much like that as possible for all of the applications that we're using to collect and manage our data and information in our built environment systems as well. We also need to be disciplined. So we really need to get away from emailing data around. Often because the systems aren't perfect, what we do is say, oh, well, it's just quicker to send it to you by email, and we do that. But then we start to lose that golden thread that Dame Judith was talking about. And the other thing we need to do is seek feedback from the users to make sure that the systems work for them. And if they don't work for them, to fix it so that they do work for them, so that we get away from this initiative fatigue problem. I was on a site once and talking to someone about, well, how about if we did X, Y, and Z? And they said, the last thing I need is another flipping digital application. And actually, we weren't trying to burden them with more. We were trying to make their job easier. But I think it can often feel at the front line like this is just making my life harder and harder. And we need to take a systems approach to thinking about our data. So whether that is as an organisation managing a building which has many systems within it, or whether that's an organisation running a complicated transport or power network, we really need to think about how do we get this data to interface from one system to the next. Because inevitably we will have different systems in different places. It's very hard to have, one unified system that works for everyone, because it would probably be a complete behemoth and deeply ineffective and inefficient. But we need to make sure that we've got those kind of transition and translation points. And we also need to move from, a concept of a series of pilots where we do things because we're in a bit of a fix, to getting all of those good examples and turning them into business as usual. So where are the really good examples around our businesses or our enterprises where people are doing things well? And can we roll that out everywhere? Can we bring everybody up to the same best practice standard? And we need to put the people at the heart of the process, because ultimately this data and this information always involves people at some point in the process, whether they are responsible for collecting the data or for interpreting the data or for making decisions based on that data. So we need to make sure that data is easy to collect, easy to access, and that the analysis systems that we use are transparent and understandable to the people that are using the outputs of them. And finally, we have to accept that this is a change process. And it's not just a change process, but it's a process that's likely to go on forever, because technology is continually changing. I was at a meeting about digital cities last week, and someone was talking about there's an EU initiative to get I think something like 95% of EU citizens to a level of digital skill by 2030. And the point she made was that the digital skills that people will need in 2030 are very different to the digital skills that they need now. Even, just for going about your daily life and connecting with your doctor or whatever else you need to do, sort of, interfacing with bureaucracy. So we need to accept that this is a change process, and it's an ongoing change process. There's no kind of perfect destination at the end of this. But hopefully every step we take will improve things and reduce the friction for data and information use, and then really help us to achieve the things we're trying to achieve. I have to say, my thunder was slightly stolen yesterday, because I went to a very excellent presentation from the Infrastructure Client Group's Project 13 team on the document they've just produced on data and digital principles for project success. Now, this is all cast around projects because that's where Project 13 is focused, but actually it's just as true whether this is about lifecycle management of information. It's a really nice, relatively simple sort of step into this whole world. And they've come up with 8 digital and data principles for project success. This is about purpose, focusing on outcomes, culture, putting people at the heart of digitalization, collaboration around shared data, defining clear and common processes, managing information as an asset with value in its own right, and that one is really important, looking after our data, being secure by design, because that actually helps us do more, and then lastly, to my previous point, seeing digitalization as a journey. And as I say, it's a journey that doesn't have an end point, really. I'm not going to go into this in any more detail, but if anyone would like to, you can find it by Googling it on the internet. And it's a really helpful document, I think, and a helpful way to sort of start to think about the issues that we need to manage when we're collaborating between different organisations as well. So in terms of what we need to do, I think we all have slightly different roles in this space, but everybody has a role. So I'm just going to finish by reflecting on those roles. So I think the key thing is that it's really important that clients take a whole life view of asset data and take responsibility for thinking about what data is required. So, understanding how your assets contribute to achieving your organizational objectives, understanding what information you need across the whole life cycle of your assets to deliver whole life value-based asset management. And for me, in many ways, the delivery of an asset is just part of that asset management process. Thinking about, for example, risk-based approaches to prioritization of asset management and maintenance through its life, really understanding how we're using our assets, which ones are most vital in the delivery of the services of whatever flavour they are that we are delivering, and therefore how we manage what is always a limited budget in that context in terms of maintaining the service through maintaining the assets. Whatever the organisation we're in, whether it's a client organisation or a supply chain organisation, we really need to have a clear digitalisation strategy for our organisation and a clear digital strategy. Those two things are slightly different. The digital strategy is about the data, the digitalisation is about the culture and the processes required to capture and curate and use that data well. There's an awful lot out there. As I say, there's the data and digital principles for project success. There's the ISO 19650 standards. There's all the wonderful documents that GIG has been producing in this space. And there's a whole community of people working on this as well. So in organizations, we need a clear digitalization strategy for the organization that's led from the top. I think the organization and senior management really need to look at the value of improved data and information management and think about whole life, not just first cost. So, in my world, that's around things like not just thinking about the cost of monitoring an asset, but what's the value you will derive from that? Because if it's going to cost you £100,000 a year, but potentially save you millions, it's really worth doing. If it's going to cost you £10,000 a year and save you nothing, it's probably not worth doing. So we really need to kind of get that value conversation right up front. We need to make sure that these strategies are clearly communicated in terms of what the benefits are to the organisation, to the customers or clients of that organisation, and how each person in the organisation has a role to contribute to that. It kind of goes back to Kennedy's point about, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And allegedly, you could ask the cleaners in NASA, what are you doing? And they'd say, we're helping put a man on the moon. That's what we need to do with our data. Everyone needs to be clear why it's important that they contribute to this. We need to support and resource the implementation of this. It doesn't happen on a wing and a prayer, and it can't be expected to happen on people's goodwill and their spare time. And we need to embed digitalisation throughout what we're doing and make sure that we are aiming to be sort of digital data first organisations. And it really helps if you get some champions involved. So find people who are enthusiastic about this, who will help their peers, but also reward those people for getting involved in that activity. And lastly, work with peer organisations. So the likes of nima, the likes of the Infrastructure Client Group. Work with your competitors as well as your customers and your colleagues to really help us move the industry forward. And that's really important because, as I said towards the beginning of the presentation, most of what we do is very much in collaboration with others. Pretty much every project involves multiple organisations. Every asset involves multiple organisations in terms of its use and management. We also need to lead from the bottom. So those of us who are not in kind of senior leadership roles really need to support digitalisation initiatives. I've written here, find your tribe. There's an awful lot of fantastic BIM and information management groups out there, most of them sitting under nima. We can manage up, so we can challenge our seniors if we think that they're not pushing this agenda forward hard enough. And we can encourage our colleagues and our peers. Some people do get exhausted by these things. Some people are slightly frightened of them. If we can help each other out, that really helps. And it's really important to engage with our professional institutions. I've just listed some here. There are many more associated with nima and with the kind of the range of other digital activities that are going on in the world at the moment. Really do engage with what they're getting up to. Most of them provide training in this space, and they all help to move the agenda forward. If we do that, then we can get on with fantastic things like driving construction to net zero by reducing uncertainty through better data. We can get on with improving the way we manage our assets throughout their 100 to 200 year life, saving money, reducing resource use, reducing carbon emissions, improving services. And we can make our cities more resilient through using better data to really understand how they're operating and what the hazards are that they face. And if we do all of that, then we'll be able to meet this vision that was expressed in the document, Our Vision for the Built Environment, to create an environment whose purpose is to enable people and nature to flourish together for generations. And then we really will be delivering on the digital dream and the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you very much. And I will stop sharing.